In 2012, I found myself on my first visit to China as Foreign Minister in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Beijing, talking to Yang Jiechi. He was the Chinese Foreign Minister. He's now an even more elevated figure in Chinese diplomacy. He registered his concern about what he said, coded language, was the strengthening of Cold War alliances in our region. I interpreted that, decoding it, as a reference to the agreement to station and exercise, to exercise and train Marines, not station them, in the Northern Territory, announced a few months earlier in late 2011. I found myself saying Australians will always be drawn to an alliance relationship with a great maritime power. We were throughout our history. And the ANZUS Treaty is not directed at China. I found myself reflecting on this later in this conversation, doing what Australian leaders had done historically, going back to Whitlam, opening the relationship with the People's Republic of China, saying at length with Zhou Enlai, this is on Whitlam's visit to China as opposition leader, that the ANZUS Treaty historically had been crafted to allay Australian fears about a resurgent Japan. It wasn't directed at China. John Howard found himself making similar points. We can reflect on whether you could do that convincingly today. From 2012, when I was Foreign Minister, I recall another very interesting meeting. It was like an encounter with an Old Testament prophet. This lanky figure in my office in Sydney, he'd flown up from Melbourne. He raised a warning finger as he made his points. I was in the process of consulting all former Australian Prime Ministers on foreign policy, and here was Malcolm Fraser. I had worn badges, shame, Fraser, shame, in 1975. Saw him as the villain who brought down the Whitlam government. But he had another mission. And he was talking about the danger of Australia being drawn automatically into a showdown between China and the United States because of the embedding of an Australian ship in the 7th Fleet and an Australian officer in the US Pacific Command at a deputy level. He said to me, these days America loses wars. He said, cruelly, he says, it can lose a land war with China in Asia and then withdraw from the region, which is not an option for us. I wasn't convinced. I thought Obama, and I increasingly think this, a very cool head in the White House making cautious decisions, unlike his predecessor, immediate predecessor. China was developing, but it had a long way to go. Fraser's vision was dystopian. War between the two was far-fetched. Today, no one can say that. And Australia's got to consider a number of issues, mainly the issue of how much independence we can take upon ourselves within the context of our alliance relationship. I support the alliance. It's a sensible position for a middle power located as Australia is. It gives us a sharper edge in the international personality we project. It gives us influence in Washington and, you could say, in some European capitals we wouldn't otherwise have. Armed neutrality is the alternative. Is to make the case for that to the Australian people. They want overwhelmingly an alliance relationship with a great and powerful friend. It's embedded in Australian thinking. I don't have to dwell on that. But right now, we face this challenge. Hugh White, in his recent essay, put it bluntly and coldly. A war between America and China means a phone call to Canberra, taking our assistance for granted and simply seeking to determine how big our contribution will be. I argue, as a result, the highest priority in Australian diplomacy today should be to avert such a war, the largest war we've seen since 1945, carrying a risk of a descent to nuclear weapons use, probably the most dangerous prospect of that we've encountered since 1983, and Operation Able Archer, the NATO exercises that the East Germans and the Russians thought might be the advent of a preemptive strike against them. Australia has moved, and I can chart it precisely, from speeches given by then Prime Minister Turnbull and Foreign Minister Julie Bishop in 2017, from maintaining a sort of strategic ambiguity about our position in a showdown on Taiwan, to, and this is most clearly spelled out in the rhetoric of former Defence Minister Peter Dutton, now Leader of the Opposition, an assumption of automaticity, pretty swift automaticity, about our commitment to a war between China and the US. Hence my argument, the highest priority in Australian diplomacy at the present time should be to avert such a conflict. There was a shift. We keep being told China has changed. Yes, China has changed. It's become the world's largest economy, and it's become more assertive. Assertive is the more precise word than aggressive. It hasn't invaded anyone else's territory, but it's been assertive in the South China Sea. Some could argue its assertiveness had characteristics in common with America's assertiveness as a growing power in the early years of the 20th century. Nonetheless, we're required to respond to it. Our involvement in the Quad is a reasonable response, a message to China that should it become more assertive, even become aggressive to nations in the region, then there are four powers talking about a possible response. This is International Relations 101. If China sees it as a potential alliance, then China would understand that its behaviour will determine whether it becomes an alliance or whether it continues to be a diplomatic talking shop. China and its behaviour will determine that. But nonetheless, Australia changed too. Please, when we hear the recitation that China has changed, let's add the realistic interpretation, Australia's changed too. We've changed very precisely, very deliberately in the words we used in addressing these questions from 2017. I charted it in my academic position heading a think tank on Australia-China relations. We aim to put China back where it was, said Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State. He said that in July 2020, and he meant regime change. One area of difference between even the coalition's positioning of Australia and the US position at this time under Trump was that our ministers were not even tempted for a moment by this enunciation of a new American goal, regime change in Beijing. Perhaps they're realistic to know that regime change, why? Well, because it works so well in Afghanistan and Iraq? No, we didn't touch that. For the leading theorist of American international relations theory, Professor John Mearsheimer, who was in Australia a couple of years ago, there's a brutal realism, and he is the great foreign policy realist, that China must be dispatched through war or Cold War. He says this: America simply does not, quote, tolerate peer competitors, unquote. He went on to say, we've had four potential peer competitors in the 20th century: Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union. We helped contain and defeat all four of them. We helped put all four of them on the scrap heap of history, unquote. Can Australia sign up to that? Because this is an enunciation that America must fight for what Gareth Evans calls the DLP words: dominance, leadership, primacy. More subtle American diplomats, Kurt Campbell is one example, talk about the America-China relationship deliberately not using words, those words, leadership, primacy, dominance. And that is reassuring to us because they are such vague concepts, they really leave open a war in response to virtually anything. Because virtually anything can be interpreted as a challenge to Americans' dominance, leadership, primacy. But would a different American administration after 2024 be restrained, as Kurt Campbell and others around Biden are, in committing to this concept? Or would they be full of Trumpian bluster? Yes, we must stop China's growth. We must put it on the scrap heap of history, to use Professor John Mearsheimer's language. We must ask of our American allies in the exchanges about this subject, what war aims are we signing on for? Sparked by an incident in the Taiwan Strait or South China Sea, the war might have as its base cause a desire by the US to block any shift in the relative balance of power between it and China. Is that realistic, or should we be accepting that China will have a stronger role in the region strategically, reflecting the continued growth of its economy, its evolution to middle-income status? It seems the wisdom in Southeast Asia is one of holding fire and allowing events to take their course. Does the Mearsheimer approach, do Americans in general, imagine that a neat military exchange will freeze China's development for all time? What is a war with China about? And what would victory be? Would it be the destruction of all of China's coastal cities, making them look like the ruined cities of post-war Germany or Japan, which John Mearsheimer referred to in that quote? Is it Americans pulling down statues of Mao in Beijing as they did in Baghdad? What does victory over China mean? What does it look like? How is a nation of 1.4 billion people permanently contained as a result of one military exchange? Malcolm Fraser's dystopian vision shared with me of America being defeated, or fighting the deadlock, one could say, or experiencing a draw, as in Korea, and then withdrawing from the region, is very real. And as Hugh White puts it, a war leading to American withdrawal would be a defeat for Australian interests. It's wise to look at Gary Woodward's article, who's a former ambassador in Beijing, on Australia and Taiwan policy. It's a revelation, and it doesn't appear in biographies of Menzies. It should, that Menzies deliberately conducted as Prime Minister from 1949 till his retirement in 1966, a policy of very deliberate strategic ambiguity over Australia's response to a showdown in the Taiwan Strait. On half a dozen occasions, Menzies intervened with the Americans to say this would not be our war. He disciplined a member of his government, Wilfred Kent Hughes, who made noises about unleashing Chiang Kai-shek. He made it clear to the Kennedy administration, want to sign Australia up to an alliance that Kennedy was thinking of organising in support of Taiwan. He declined deliberately several US requests to open a diplomatic mission in Taipei to reciprocate Taiwan's mission in Canberra. Nothing doing, said Menzies. Harold Holt, his successor, took a different view. He declined an invitation to enter an anti-communist new Pacific community that included Taiwan. When Alexander Downer was asked in August 2004 on a visit to Beijing, the first foreign minister since the election of the Howard government to go there, he was foreign minister since the election of the Howard government. He was asked a question by an Australian correspondent, Hamish MacDonald. In the Australian media the next day, McDonald's article reported Australia would not feel obligated under the ANZUS Treaty to help US forces defend Taiwan if China tried to regain the island by military force. McDonald's article quoted Alexander Downer saying the ANZUS Treaty is invoked in the event of one of our two countries, Australia or the US, being attacked. So some other military activity elsewhere in the world, be it in Iraq or anywhere else for that matter, doesn't automatically invoke the ANZUS Treaty, he said. It's important to remember that, direct quote. We've only ever invoked the ANZUS Treaty once, after the events of 9/11. McDonald went on to quote a former senior US defence official with a responsibility for managing the alliance, who welcomed Downer's comments, saying the treaty is about an obligation to consult rather than an automatic offer of armed forces. Remarkable, 2004. McDonald elicited comment from the then director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Hugh White, who made the point that, quote, the view had been widely, if quietly, held for years, particularly as Taiwan's leadership becomes more aggressive about independence. McDonald told me when I spoke to him 2 years ago that following his report he sought comment from researchers in the East-West Centre in Hawaii, a think tank with links to the US Pacific Command. He recalls the response was along the lines, quote, the Downer comment is fine by us. We always assumed that any war over Taiwan would be handled by us, with Australia and Japan on the sidelines, unquote. While Downer and Howard, under American pressure, made a partial retreat, nothing they did or said amounted to any automatic assumption that, in the event of a clash over Taiwan, Australia would be joining the fight. When I became Foreign Minister, I asked DFAT for advice about my first visit to China. I said, what if I get asked the Alexander Downer question? I want to be prepared. And back came a very good briefing note. It was just one page. And it said, if asked, say it's a hypothetical question. They anticipated my response, but what if I'm asked again? If asked again, said the advice, say that the ANZUS Treaty is an obligation to consult. That little briefing note, I wish I'd folded it up and put it in my pocket, was a summation of the distilled wisdom of the Menzies era that Alexander Downer, wisely or unwisely, put on the record in 2004. Strategic ambiguity about our response to a showdown between the US, something that had been the policy of the Menzies government all those years, captured by that crucially important article by Gary Woodard, former ambassador, Australia's China policy of strategic ambiguity, navigating between big fish, that had been published in the Australian Journal of International Affairs in 2018, which I recommend. We now have eliminated the strategic ambiguity. That has been the shift from Menzies to Morrison. That's where we stand. For that reason, my bottom line recommendation to this gathering is we focus on what Australia can do as a creative middle power to avoid the prospect of a contest over primacy, diplomacy and leadership, or even something less than that, over America saying this is not about us going to war to maintain our leadership, our primacy, our dominance, but to prevent China getting such leadership, primacy, dominance. If China is going to enhance its position strategically in this region, it will reflect what happens to its economy, how far it continues to grow, whether it continues to grow in the 2030s at all, or whether we have reached some sort of stasis. And China is going to be a big power, but not one whose economy will propel it year by year to a greater dominance. It will continue, in other words, to enjoy shared responsibilities with the US in a region where the 10 nations of Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand and Japan balance themselves in diplomacy with China and the US in a kind of stasis. a kind of stability. That might be the most likely prospect. There's only one other point I'll share with you as I bring my remarks to a close, and that is that foreign policy is about the personality we choose to project of ourselves in the world community. When I was Foreign Minister, I had a pleasure seeking a seat for us for a 2-year term on the Security Council, going to a meeting of Caribbean nations in New York, the 14 nations of CARICOM. I was making a pitch like a candidate in a rank-and-file pre-selection in my own great party, going to a branch meeting and saying, "Will you vote for me?" and aiming to get all 14 votes locked up in my pocket as I left. Thus, as Foreign Minister, I was talking to the 14 nations of the Caribbean. Will you vote for us on the ballot for the Security Council? And it was a beautiful meeting because I got this response from the ambassador to the UN from Grenada. She said, "Mr. Foreign Minister, we've considered all the arguments you've made to us today. You've said you're committed to action on climate. You said you're committed to action on the ocean environment. We like these commitments. You said you're committed to the Small Arms Treaty, which is very important to us, mopping up the small arms that are being traded around. That's important to us as small island developing states. And finally, you've reinforced the commitment Kevin Rudd made to a monument to the transatlantic slave trade." I can tell you these 14 nations of CARICOM will vote for Australia. And she added this. She said, "Besides, we've greatly appreciated your Prime Minister's apology to your Aboriginal citizens." She said that. So she was responding to a certain personality that Australia had, and it reinforces Gareth Evans' argument that being a good global citizen is good for its own reason, but also in your national interest, because it gives you an enhanced role and it has other nations listen to you. Is it possible for us, under the US alliance, to have an independent character as well? To have space for us to run a pragmatic policy of engagement with China, for example. Space to construct international initiatives that may not meet the enthusiasm of Washington, but which in the end Washington recognises as valid and interesting and worthwhile. Are we prepared to push the alliance in something that I think is symbolic, like Australia saying we want Washington just quietly drop the extradition proceedings on Julian Assange? Are we confident and mature enough to say, yes, we've contributed a great deal for the alliance and we continue to do so? The continuity of our Quad commitment, for example, made by Anthony Albanese, we're entitled to push, and to push quite firmly if Americans first time round say they can't deliver on Assange. We're entitled to go back and say, no, this is an alliance request. And it's a priority for us. The notion, and I'm still groping for the words that put it concisely, the notion of us exercising more independence under the architecture and with the legitimate considerations that go with that alliance relationship. In the past, you've had governments, Fraser's is one, Hawke's is another, where it's been possible to enter into vigorous argument with our American partner. I think we've lost that habit in recent years, and I think it's in America's interests, it's in our own, if we retrieve it. Thank you.
Bob, thank you very, very much. We now have, we're delighted that Bob, like the other speakers, is happy to take questions. One thing we've decided to do is that, although this is inspired by events in the past, that the youth of today are the ones who have to live with the consequences and increasingly must shape our answers to these questions. So what we've done is for each session, there's a young member of the UNAA, and it's not somebody who, like me, who defines young as 1 year older than myself. But in this particular case, the thing is that UNAA has nominated Tao Chen to ask the first question of Bob, and it ask Tao to come down to the standing microphone here. And anybody else who wants to ask a question, please come down and queue up behind Tao Chen. Tao, your question.
Okay, Tao from the United Nations Association of Australia. This is a question probably you're being asked a lot, like, in the possible event of the China invasion of Taiwan, should Australia get involved, in this conflict? If America is attacked, do we have any legal obligations if America asks? Thank you.
Well, that is the absolute essence. Congratulations on the acuity of that question. That gets us to the very heart of it. I came here with a copy of the ANZUS Treaty in my folder, but the clauses about that use the language an attack on the territory of either partner or a threat to the forces don't really apply in the event of a shock incident like that. Because the American Secretary of State who rings their Australian counterpart in Washington won't have that treaty on the desk. They'll be saying, we've been attacked, you're an ally, we want a contribution. And as Hugh White says in his most recent essay, it won't be the sort of token contribution that we've handed the Americans in, for example, and very useful one, the invasion of Iraq, the more sizable one, the largest non-NATO contribution in respect of Afghanistan. It would be a very significant contribution. We can only guess at how quickly we would assemble what would be the Australian offer. Now, these are horrific things to contemplate. Therefore, my point, given that the American request will not be guided by the fine language of the ANZUS Treaty, but simply by the living, breathing reality of an alliance relationship, our highest goal in diplomacy right now should be engagement with Japan, with the 10 nations of ASEAN, with the United States itself, about the sort of off-ramps and guardrails, making reference to the diplomacy, probably very advanced diplomacy, between Jake Sullivan and Yang Jiechi, who you remember was Foreign Minister in 2012, now has a higher role. And seeing, I'd even envisage this, seeing that the US Republican Party, rather likely to be returned to the White House in 2024 and to control of the Senate at the end of this year, are persuaded as well that diplomacy between them and China, as opposed to a drift to war, is what we all need.
Well, thank you very much for your speech, Bob. I'm the manager of the United Nations Association's Peace and Security Program, and the young people that are here today are part of that program. I'm also the chairperson of the Independent and Peaceful Australia Network, an Australia-wide organisation that brings together large unions, faith groups, peace groups around the country. So, we're very concerned, as you have expressed in your speech, I think, about the increasing risk, let's say risk rather than likelihood, of a major war between China and the United States, or you could reverse that, between the United States and China. The things that you brought up in your speech about the change that has happened, in particular as a result of the last 9 years of government with the Morrison and Dutton approach to our international relations with China, are really concerning. And I also follow John Mearsheimer's talks whenever he's given those, particularly in Australia. One of the things that struck me in one of his presentations was that if Australia dared to do what you've just suggested, push within that relationship, then that would not be tolerated. He said we could very easily be cast aside as yet another enemy of the United States. I think it's really important that we do work on those push factors, and I think it's important that we look at our nearest neighbour, New Zealand, and the history of New Zealand in taking a stand on the nuclear ships coming into their waters. How far do you think Australia can push in our relationship within the alliance before we get that feedback that John Mearsheimer talked about? That's my question.
Well, we go into discussions with our allies, the Americans, with a strong claim to be taken seriously. We host American facilities, which we call joint facilities, on the Australian mainland. We made that big contribution to Afghanistan, and we kept it there at American insistence, politely put, even when Canberra began to get tired of what we now know to have been an impossible military mission. We've been supportive on so many fronts that were we to take the approach enunciated by Kevin Rudd in his recent writings, article in Foreign Affairs just out, and his book called The Avoidable War, with practical suggestions, talking in Washington about Jake Sullivan's talks with his Chinese interlocutor, pushing for more commitment to avoidance measures, seeking to build areas of American-Chinese collaboration. And yes, with the Chinese doing what we haven't been able to do since 2017, go there and talk and say to them firmly, any more pressure by you on the border, the Sino-Indian border, or any more assertiveness in the South China Sea will be met with affirming of the commitments by the Quad partners. If you don't want to see the Quad become some sort of quasi or incipient embryonic treaty relationship, my dear friend Wang Yi, it's up to you. We haven't been able to have that candid minister-to-minister talk with the Chinese for the last 5 or 6 years. We've taken ourselves out. Japanese can, the Indians can. We're the one American ally that hasn't had a continuing dialogue with China. And that is an absurd thing to sacrifice. And we didn't have to be the lead nation using adversarial language to get a world inquiry into the early management and origins of COVID. We could have used diplomacy and had the same outcome without turning it into a giant, offensive, adversarial anti-Chinese gesture, for example.
Thank you, Professor Carter. Carr, I'd like to, if I could ask, to get your reflections on the alliance beyond the South China Seas and beyond China. And in particular, I'm interested in how our alliance led us into Afghanistan, which it turned out to be Australia's longest running war of 20 years. And in particular, I'm just wondering what you see as the learning lessons from that experience. And of course, the reasons the US was involved, and perhaps even our own, changed. There were strategic changes from when the first attack on Afghanistan after 9/11 to what happened over the different decades. So I'm really interested to see what you think we can learn from that experience, particularly when is it the right time to say, we're not going there, and it doesn't have anything to do with our alliance.
Well, the simple lesson is that the myth of anti-insurgency, counterinsurgency, has got to be acknowledged. the notion of Western armies mobilised expeditionary forces, to use the old-fashioned language, to go in and run counterinsurgency campaigns in generally hostile territory. Those days are over. And a whole grand American design based on counterinsurgency has had its day. Swift intervention with our American partners to take out Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan was altogether appropriate. Changing the goals of the war, changing the mission to stay there to build a different type of government and eliminate the Taliban was inviting the defeat we saw in August last year with the planes taking off, America getting out, another humiliating setback that has reverberated around the world. I don't rule out limited, carefully defined interventions as a result of the alliance. I thought Tony Abbott made the commitment that a humanitarian intervention providing planes and trainers from our army in the battle against ISIS and to protect civilians who were being targeted by it was legitimate, with an end date and an explicit repudiation of us being committed to an open-ended war on terrorism. That sort of commitment, very supportive to the Americans and sought by them, was legitimate. I would have taken a different approach when it came to dispatching a warship to the Gulf as part of the Trump administration's building up of pressure on Iran, because I would have taken the view, as even the coalition government did, that tearing up the nuclear treaty with Iran by the Trump administration was altogether counterproductive.
Thank you. My name is Akashika Mola, and I'm one of the law students here at the Griffith University. I've read your book, and I have a very dear question for you from the land of India. I know you've very much enjoyed the Dal, but given your time as the foreign minister and your visit to India then, what was your idea of Quad then to what it would be for now in the precarious state of affairs, international affairs that we are in? Thank you.
Yeah, India is a natural partner of Australia's. It was interesting when I was in India as foreign minister in 2013, my Indian interlocutors did not want to talk about China. India was in a sweet spot, being courted by America, being courted by China. China changed that Indian disposition, and China's got to live with the consequences. It forced India into Quad membership. The thing for us to note, and Hugh White's made this point, and Paul Keating, is that we can't assume for a minute that India's got a commitment to East Asia. It hasn't. It will continue to be focused on the Indian Ocean. To assume that India will take a stand on Taiwan, especially after India's indifference to the blandishments of America about Ukraine, is to delude ourselves. India is focused on its part of the world, and its position on Ukraine confirms they're not going to surrender their foreign policy subtleties and nuances to obligations as a member of the Quad. So I think we should respect India by acknowledging that the Quad doesn't represent its international personality in its entirety, or even to any large extent. But India will be, as I said, a natural partners of Australia. I think our challenge is to see that engagement with India goes beyond the cliches that have had us talk about our shared heritage and our interest in cricket.
Hi there. My name's Alex Hine. I'm a student here at Griffith University. And thank you for the speech. It was really fantastic. I'm currently applying in the application for Fulbright to pretty much look at this exact topic because I think it's really important to have more Australians studying in America about Chinese foreign relations and things like that. What would be your advice, or what would you think, if I was successful, would be a great thing to study in this realm? What would be the most important thing for the future to study?
I think probing beyond the cliches of the current bipartisanship of anti-China attitudes in Washington would be interesting. What scope is there, given America's definition of China as an adversary? Not eliminating areas of potential cooperation. The Biden administration hasn't done that. They need to be explored and pushed more. But what scope is there for some G2 concept of America and China, to put it crudely, sharing power, especially in the Pacific? What interest might there be in Beijing in alternatives to the fairly assertive diplomacy we've seen in the last 5 years, and how America might respond? There are two issues that can never be engaged with on Capitol Hill. One is Israel, and the other is Russia. Is it possible sometime in the future to see America doing a reverse Kissinger, and that is engaging with Russia, I guess a post-Putin Russia, in response to China's continued rise? Or in fact, are we looking at Kissinger, an opening to China because Russia is considered a durable menace? These are the moving parts. The old wise men around Washington in the Kissinger school, George Shultz recently died, but there are some others who've been shaken by the excesses of anti-China exuberance that have taken hold in Washington, and they've watched from the sidelines. Would there be, is there any possibility in American attitudes and American unease over the China challenge for a more collaborative relationship with China? And what would be needed to bring it about? I met yesterday in Sydney with the president of Sinn Féin, and she's leader of the opposition in the Dáil in the Chinese parliament, in the Irish parliament, she's talking about the fact that Sinn Féin is now the majority party in the Stormont in the north, and I said, who can believe the possibilities that politics sometimes presents? We shouldn't be, having witnessed in our time the fall of apartheid and the fall of communist rule throughout Eastern Europe, we should never eliminate from our consideration the possibility of events over the horizon. We should always be alert to the possibility that resides in political engagement. The biggest challenge is a world without nuclear weapons. But if Henry Kissinger can put his signature to such a proposal, very easy to dismiss as too idealistic, who are we to cavil? And to talk about Beijing-Washington collaboration to solve some of the problems of the planet, arms, climate, should not be beyond our capacity as free-thinking thinkers in international relations, in a creative middle power. Thank you.